right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the session. Thank you for coming in. Happy Sunday. I hope everyone is healthy and safe wherever you are in the world today. And I want to thank you for joining me in the session. So we are now in our, I think 29th or 30th session of Live Sacred Space. And as always, I just want to express that I'm super honored to be with you here together in this time of sensitivity and uncertainty. And I look forward to sharing time with you in our shared sacred space together today. So what I want to do here is a couple things in our session today. The first is I'll go ahead and set sacred space, and then we'll have our topic for the week. And the topic for this week is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is the healing power of Fairytale. The healing power of Fairytale. So we'll talk about that. Gowrie has selected the next story from her sort of muse and intuition that gave rise to this topic. So we'll have that. We'll have our discussion and story, and then we'll do a little exercise around that, and then we'll close sacred space. Okay, so for now, I will go ahead then and open our sacred space together. Our intention here together is to have a space, to create a space together, which is devoid of fear, threat, and control, in order for us to, each of us individually, to be able to open to higher guidance from within our own selves, however we define higher guidance and have traditionally taken it in. And the idea here is to create a safe sanctuary space for us all to be able to relax and surrender with no fear of any danger or threat coming in from the outside, so that we can partake of the nourishment, the emotional nourishment and spiritual nourishment that comes from being in sacred space together as a group. In an opening sacred space today, I will propose, as I do every Sunday, that we all follow the 4 principles of Presidian sacred space. The first is confidentiality, standard Vegas rules. What happens in sacred space stays in sacred space. Now, of course, we're on the internet here, and the video feed is public and open to everyone. It's one of the reasons why we don't do this Zoom call style, right? So the way we would do confidentiality is that we would do it through anonymization. So you don't have to be anonymous, but you can if you want to. And the way you would do that is you would come into the Crowdcast stream, you would register and log in, and then you would go into the edit profile feature and change your username to Mickey Mouse Harry Potter, and then continue to chat or ask questions or what have you anonymously. Only if you want, you don't have to do that. The second principle is no fear, threat, or control. So no threat, no controlling, which also means not just sort of toxic mudslinging, but also no actions of fixing, curing, helping, giving advice, tough love, right? And now there's nothing wrong with those things, but because those things are of, sort of the nature of controlling, right? Even if they're controlling with a good intention, those belong in the realm of the profane, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with profane. It's not bad. It's just different. Here in sacred space, the intention is that we hold space for each other to be however we actually are, and to be seen and witnessed and held however we actually are, right? With no fear of any intervention, even if it's well-meaning intervention. So we hold space for each other to be afraid, to be a mess, to be anxious, to be angry with a reason, to be angry with no reason, right? Or to be happy, to be relaxed, to be at peace and at our ease. And then maybe on top of that, to feel guilty or uncomfortable that we feel at peace and at our ease, even though so much else is happening in the world around us. However we find ourselves to be, we are mutually okay with that, and that will amplify our ability to be okay with that within our own selves. And we hold space for that, literally hold this group sacred space for that. So that's number 2. Number 3 is a corollary, no commerce. So because of number 2, nothing also may be sold or recommended or suggested. I can't sell you anything, but even if it's sort of free, if it's like, well, I had a cousin with a problem like that and she read this book and you should read that book. Even recommendations we leave off the table, because in sacred space, we are here for your energy, not for the things you bring. We are here for what you are, not for what you provide. It's simply a different kind of space. And then the 4th is that there is no expectation of participation. So there's no pressure to do anything, to chat or not chat, to ask questions or not ask questions, to do the exercises we'll suggest or come up with or not. Again, the nourishment comes from the held space together and your presence and attention when you feel like giving it. So if you leave, go make a cup of coffee or leave the session entirely and come back and watch from the replay, all of that's totally okay. Come and go as you please. This is a safe space for you to do and be as you need to be. And the nourishment comes from what you are, not from what you do or provide. Okay. Now you can do this on your own, as we've said in previous sessions, and we can do this in a group. When we do it in a group, all of us doing it together will tend to amplify this effect, right? So that's kind of why we gather, just to kind of say hooray, and it's like this potluck feast of energy and attention and held space that we all come together to sort of cook and provide. And then there's this huge pot of nourishing sacred space in the middle, and we all kind of just nourish ourselves from that. And it's kind of funny, these kinds of things. Being in sacred space with all of you, I end up creating with you more than any of us individually could ever take in. Like it's this amplifying, multiplying. I almost think of, the Christ's story of the multiplication of the fishes and loaves, right? Sort of nourishment and insight, loaves and fishes, if you were to read that mythopoetically. And it's just, we start off with feeling like not enough in each of our individual selves. And then by the end of it, there's so much, it's just spilling over. And we're like, we have so much, we could have invited, 10 times the number of people and still had way more than we needed. That's the beauty of a sacred space like this, done in a certain way, So anyway, this is what I propose. And if you are not okay with entering into sacred space at this point, that's totally okay. We will give you a moment now to withdraw from the group. And there's no fear, threat, or control for you to, have to stay because you really need this if we're going through a tough time. Absolutely do whatever you want. Come and go as you please. And if you do choose to withdraw from the group at this point, we will catch up with you later in profane space. We'll still hang out. No worries at all. Okay. So I'll give you all a moment to dial that in and make your selection. Okay. And for now, for the rest of us, we will now move together into sacred space. And as we come together now into sacred space, I'll just remind us of the 4 principles: confidentiality/anonymization, no fear, threat, or control, no commerce, no recommendations, and no expectation of participation. Welcome to sacred space. One of the best parts of my week. All right, so the topic we thought we would cover today is the topic of the healing power of fairy tale. Now, we've talked about myth, we've talked about all these different things, mythopoetics, and in this session, we want to explore a little bit into the healing power of fairy tale and what a fairy tale actually is and how it can be used for guidance and self-healing. To do this, we will use a classic fairy tale from the Grimm brothers collection, Hansel and Gretel. to explore the themes of inner feminine initiation, which will echo the theme of inner masculine initiation that we had from our last session. So the first question, of course, is, what is a fairy tale? And I'll just give the quick thumbnail of all this, right? I don't want to turn into this a big sort of academic sort of talk. But a fairy tale is basically a folk tale. Folk meaning the people. So tales of the folks, tales from the people, the indigenous people of any given sort of geography or land, typically from the oral tradition. Now, in the case of Grimm brothers, there are scholars who date these story fragments and themes back as far as 10 to 15,000 years, in the past, in terms of fragments and sort of cave paintings, et cetera, et cetera. These story themes and fragments are very, very old. And just a quick thumbnail, kind of casual layperson's thumbnail of the history of fairy tales is that fairy tales can be thought of as a traditional part of pagan religion, right? Sort of pre-Christian, even in some sense pre-Hellenic, pre-Greek religion of nature, of people being very closely connected to the land, witches, right, in a good sense, matriarchy, feminine leadership in human tribes and societies, which implies, deeper connection to nature, embodiment, and deep connection to the land. And in the Grimm tradition, everything I would say would apply to the land in Europe and Northern Europe. Right, so we think of, in America, the Native Americans or the Aboriginal Australians, right, or sort of traditional East African, West African tribes. Even in South Asia, right, Indian culture, the beauty of Indian culture is that a lot of those sort of indigenous tribes have remained the dominant sort of, strain of culture. So when you study something like Hinduism, it's been modernized and there are all kinds of issues of patriarchy still, but you can trace these things like very clearly all the way back. It's one of the beauties of having a civilization that has basically through different phases of evolution still survived intact as a people and a nation through, 10, 15,000 years, right? And so here then, you also then have this same phenomenon in Europe, pre-Christianity. Right, so you think about the Native Americans and the white people coming in and stamping them out. Well, if you trace the sort of heritage and lineage of the white people, sort of the Northern Europeans back to pre-Christianity, right, they had similar kinds of traditions too. They had their own versions of Hoyote and Raven and all the rest of it, okay? And fairy tales, in many significant senses, are one of the last surviving threads or river streams or remnants, right, of that tradition. Now, the Catholic Inquisition, when it happened in Europe, was basically a mass genocide of for the most part, women, witches, matriarchs, feminine leaders of villages. This is a sort of, this is all documented history. It's not taught in the schools, but basically over this time period, hundreds of thousands of women, leaders, were executed, drowned, burned at the stake. It was a complete wipeout of pagan religious tradition. The Cathars, all of them were there were villages of 7,000, 10,000 people that were just wiped out in order to cement the control of the Catholic Church in Europe. Now, we're not going to get into this very deeply, and again, I was raised Catholic. This is just, when you have a religion that's 2,000 years old, there's going to be a lot of things that have happened that we don't necessarily identify with now. But part of the reason we know these things happen, where we have the historical record, just to give you a sense of this, it's like, where is this coming from? Where is he bringing this up? Is that, In doing this, the Catholic leaders, the military, the Catholic sort of military mercenaries that were deployed to sort of do these things during this period of history, would wipe everything out. All the records would be, any books, any writings would be burned. Elders, largely women who had, sort of the oral tradition, the knowledge in them, were simply killed. That's just the easiest way to sort of burn those books, which is you would just burn those people. And what's interesting is that the surviving documentation that we have are instances where the local bishop who would sort of, manage these aspects, these acts of genocide, would often end up being, there are a couple of instances where they ended up being promoted in their career to pope, right? Some of these men, these leaders, in their early careers, sort of managed the different aspects of the Inquisition. And then eventually, some of them became pope. And there's this funny little thing in Catholic tradition where if you become pope, all of your correspondence that existed up to that point, from when you were a young man in the sort of Catholic sort of military or armies or clergy or whatever, had to be preserved in the Vatican archives. So in the 80s and 90s, a number of scholars went into the Vatican archives and they caught all of these references to what, for instance, Catholic belief was, what the belief system was, because of the transcripts of these popes back when they were bishops and high inquisitors, interviewing people during the Inquisition to basically root out, give us the names and we'll go and we'll exterminate them. And the transcripts of these by Catholic law had to be preserved, and that's what they kind of did their, whatever the Vatican equivalent of Freedom of Information Act is, and looked it up, pulled out the information. And a lot of what we know about sort of this heretical, outside of fairy tales, comes from those records, right? So anyway, not to be too depressing on a Sunday morning here, but the point is that fairy tales were a part of this cultural tradition. And one of the only reasons they were left alone and you were permitted to still tell fairy tales is because they said, well, these fairy tales are not a big deal. They don't, sort of say anything bad about Christ or sort of lead them away. They don't claim the Virgin Mary was actually a goddess. They're fine. I mean, they're completely orthogonal to any of that. And they're just harmless children's tales. They're just tales we use to scare our children, to make sure they'll grow up to be good men and women. And why wouldn't the Catholic Church want that? And the church elders were like, fine, we're not going to bother ourselves with that. We have enough fish to fry, right? Even though that's not what they actually were. And then only in the 1800s were they actually collected from the oral tradition and written down by the brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, right? And they collected them from the folk, from the people. And so there are certain schools of thought, and I subscribe to these, right, where these fairy tales are actually stories and archetypes, right, that are basically the dioramas of archetypal physics in a person, kind of operating manuals, kind of diagrammatic schematics of how inner transformations happen, how they happen, why they happen. And they are part of, you can think of them as part of the wisdom tradition of nature religion, right? The pagan indigenous religion, in this case, in the Grimm's case, of Northern Europe. So you can think of them as instruction manuals and operating manuals of the human soul, if you know how to read them, which is through the lens of mythopoetics, not Cartesian, sort of, everything is just mechanical. Through the lens of mythos, not through the lens of logos. Joseph Campbell, right, the sort of follow your bliss guy, used to say that the best education in myth and symbol was just to read the Grimm fairy tales. But of course, you have to know how to read them. Otherwise, you actually read the Grimm fairy tales, nothing makes sense. we because we call them children's tales, when we read them to our kids, we try to read them like allegory, right? So the moral is, and as a result, they get really tiresome really fast, and they don't ever really even make sense as allegory, because there are always the parts that don't fit into any moralizing reading of the story. Even, the Frog King, like the Princess and the Frog, she gets to marry Prince Charming in the end, even though she was a total sort of horrible person to him, right? So where is the moral in that? And so the way to read fairy tales is to read them like dreams, where you read them as, in our method, right? When you read them with a lens where every major actor in the dream is a symbol of a different part of your own inner self. And so when you hit the play button, you watch Hansel and Gretel and the witch and the stepmother kind of move through their motions. These are all different parts of your own inner self. And by watching the diorama of how they sort of work and interact, watching who does what to whom, and what symbols pop up at what time in the mechanics and unfolding of the story, you can get insight from the symbol as to how these transformations work within a person. So you're reading them as symbol, not allegory. And in order to get some portion of the wisdom that they can yield. And the beautiful thing of these stories is that every time you read them, you get something a little bit different. And reading many of them, you start to compile a composite picture of the workings of the human spirit through its different life cycles. So I love fairy tales. They're rich, almost inexhaustible veins of like gold and insight that you can have. A lot of the insights that I have gotten in my own healing practice, right, as a healer, as a speaker, and insights that I use actively in my practice with advisees every day, I have gotten from my work with fairy tales, both with advisees and also personally in my own life. For those of you who have done healing with me, right, we have this motif called the lost board member. Well, the original symbol of the lost board member was the frog from the Frog King. I used to call the lost board member the frog, and people would say, huh? And I'd have to tell the whole story, explain everything. And only later did it turn into the more crystallized, generalized lost board member motif that we talk about in 7-Day Healing. The Frog King, right? Grimm Brothers story number 1. And there were about 250, 300 stories in all in the Grimm's collections, is the classic example I use. And actually, I'm just going to dump that, the link to that. You've had this in previous live sacred spaces, but just for convenience, I'll dump it in the chat here. And then Gary, maybe you can sort of dump that in the Facebook live as well for everyone. So that's the classic example I use if you want to sort of get, start from the beginning. And for today's session, Gary, from her intuition, has selected Hansel and Gretel, which is lovely. And because of this role we've been on with these folktales, you can almost say that you can treat then Hansel and Gretel as the next dream in this 4-dream series of the past month of Sacred Space sessions. So with that, I'd like to call Gary on screen and see what the story brings forward for us this week. Hey, Gary.
Hi, how are you?
Good morning, good evening. Thanks for joining us again. Appreciate you. And so with that intro, I would like to invite, do you have any additional thoughts to share? And then, to take us through the story when you feel ready.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's very hard to kind of express what is it really that the fairy tales do to you. But every time you listen to fairy tales or read fairy tales, there's a fascinating aspect to them where you just sort of raptured by them at all ages, and we tend to ignore them after a while. But then, they are fascinating stories, even though a lot of times they simply don't seem to make sense. So I see a trend where they're kind of taken apart in the modern critical thinking kind of an environment where you say, how can this be okay? How can this make sense? But despite all that, and we tried to kind of change some aspects of the story to fit our modern value system and all of that. But despite that, we simply don't seem to be able to ignore fairy tales, which is what I kind of love about that. They just stick onto us. So, yeah.
I mean, you might almost say that, from a couple sessions ago, we talked about the idea of story and song, and how stories and archetypes almost have their own intelligence and will, and even craftiness and wiliness, where they will try to insert themselves and inject themselves into your life at a certain point, to guide you, to give you insight, to help propel you forward in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And so, fairy tale versus myth. A myth is a fuller sort of epic story, and a fairy tale, there's a school of thought that says a fairy tale is the most distillated kind of quintessence, right, of a certain archetype.
Right.
Of a certain archetype. Right? Because sometimes you read a fairy tale and it comes across as like a message fragment, right? Where it's just like, it's like when you get a dream, you don't get this full epic dream. You get this one scene, your dad's like opening the refrigerator and closing it again, and that's it. And people think that doesn't count, but you can take even that fragment as its own sort of mini kind of fairy tale, and you can still mine it for insight and meaning, if you want to.
Right. So Hansel and Gretel just came to me like that. I mean, it was almost like when I was walking and not even thinking about what story I wanted to pick, that title just kept coming back in my head. And then finally I realized, okay, you know what? This is a message saying that's the story I need to read. Right. Even though I kind of don't know what it's about. And it's been so long since I read it that I had to go back and read it again. So so I'm really excited about how it kind of fits into our whole series of stories we've been doing.
We'll
So I'll start off with that. So I think a lot of people are familiar with Hansel and Gretel because it's kind of part of our childhood, but I would want to, today what I'm going to say is the unabridged original Grimm's, version, and not the kind of simplified version that we find in children's books most times. So there's a lot of details in there which are kind of surprising and interesting. So the Grimm's book, the way it describes Hansel and Gretel is that starts saying that next to a great forest, there lived a woodcutter and his wife and his 2 children. And he was a poor woodcutter, not exactly well off. And his 2 children were young kids, a boy and a girl, named Hansel and Gretel. And already he was poor, but once there was a famine, which meant that there wasn't much food for anyone. And the woodcutter really struggled to provide for the family. And one night he was lying in bed and worrying about this. And he said to his wife, "We hardly have anything for ourselves. How are we going to feed the kids?" And the woman said, "Listen, we could do this. Tomorrow we take the kids to the deepest part of the woods, and then we'll make the pretext of going into the woods to get, cut wood and get it back, and we'll just leave them there, and we come back home.
Abandon
them, just abandon them." And the man's like, "But I don't want to do that. I mean, imagine what could happen to the kids. They could be killed by wild animals. And how could we just leave them there?" And the woman says, "Well, you're a fool, because if it just continues this way, all 4 of us will starve. And by this, at least the 2 of us, will survive." And she kept nagging that point until he agreed.
Hmm.
But he kept saying, but I do feel sorry for the children and that we're abandoning them, right? But, so there's this conversation happened, and the children were sleeping in the other room. They kind of couldn't sleep because they were hungry. They were awake and they heard this conversation. And Gretel started to cry, saying, that's it, we're done, it's over with us. And then Hansel says, it's okay, don't worry, I know what to do. And this little boy, once the grown-ups had fallen asleep, he got up and went out. And there was full moon, and the moon was shining, and there were pebbles on the ground which shone like silver pebbles and silver coins. So he picked up all those pebbles, filled them in he had worn a jacket, so he filled them in his jacket pockets as much as he can. And then he came back in and he told Gretel, don't worry, you sleep well. Okay, I know what to do, and we'll be fine. And the next day morning, even before sunrise, the woman woke up the children, right? And she tells them, get up, lazy bones, we have to go into the woods. And then she gives them a piece of bread each and says, this is for midday. Don't eat it any sooner because you're not going to get any more, right? So they take, the pieces of bread, and Gretel puts both the pieces of bread in her apron because Hansel has his pockets full. And they take this from their stepmother, and then, they start walking towards the woods. And Hansel is clever, so he kind of falls behind and keeps stopping and looking back so that he remembers the trail. And he starts to put the pebbles all the way, so that then that forms a trail so he could trace his way back. And his father says, why are you stopping and why are you looking back? And Hansel comes up with this thing that, I'm looking at the white cat on the roof of our house, and he's saying goodbye to me. And the woman says, that's not a cat, that's just the morning sun shining on the chimney. So, but anyway, so Hansel's made his excuse, and he keep going. And by the time they reach the middle of the woods, the mother and father ask them to make a fire collecting twigs. They leave them by the fire and tell them to stay there until they get back with all the wood they've cut. And children, after a while, eat their bread and they fall asleep by the fire. By the time they wake up, it's already dark. And they're alone. And Gretel starts crying again. And Hansel tells her, it's okay, just wait until the moon comes out and then we'll be fine. And the moon comes out, and they can actually see what's around them. And Hansel takes a hand, and starts walking. And with the help of the pebbles that he had put earlier, he's able to trace his way back the way they came. And they keep walking all night, and by early morning, they reach their father's house. And the father is so happy to see them back again. He hugs them and is just so glad, and he decides he's not going to, let them go again, right? And the stepmother is, she acts surprised, and she says, oh, you slept so long, we thought you didn't want to come back and all of that. Anyway, so they're reunited, and this is fine. Until the next time there is a crisis again, there's famine, and, they don't have enough food to eat. And the stepmother brings this up again with the husband and says, we have to let the kids go. We have to leave them in the forest, or else we won't be able to manage. And this time the father really doesn't want to do that, but as the story says, if you've said A, then you have to say B. And if you've agreed once, then you have to agree again. And because he had said okay the first time, she kept insisting and pushing until he agreed again. So again, the kids overheard this conversation. And again, Hansel assured Gretel that it's okay, we'll be fine. But this time when he tried to go out to collect the pebbles, the stepmother had already locked the door, so he couldn't open the door and get out. So he came back and, he told Gretel, it's okay, we'll figure our way out, we'll be fine. And the next day, the same thing happens at daybreak. They leave the house, they go into the woods. They reach the middle of the woods, a clearing. They're told to make a fire. They sit by the fire. And this time they have the pieces of bread. And what Hansel does all this way is, because he doesn't have pebbles to leave as a trail, he leaves breadcrumbs from the slice of bread that he had in his pocket, hoping that when the moon comes out at night, he'll be able to trace his way back. And the same thing happens. The parents leave them, they fall asleep, and when they wake up, it's night. And the moon comes out, and Hansel says, okay, let's find our way back. But this time, all the birds in the forest have eaten up the breadcrumbs. So they can't find their way back. And, Hansel is still reassuring. He takes his sister's hand and says, it's okay, we'll find a way. And they keep walking and walking. Whole night, whole day next day, until, sunset, and still nothing. They're completely lost. And they've just eaten small berries that grew in the forest. They're hungry, they're tired, they're scared. So they just sleep under a tree. And the next day at noon, they spot a white bird sitting on a tree, flapping its wings and singing beautifully. And they're fascinated by that bird. So they follow the bird. And it turns out that the bird actually is leading them. And after a while, the bird leads them to a cottage. And this cottage is fascinating. It's made completely of bread. And for roof, roof is a cake, and the house is a bread, and the windows are made of clear sugar. And the bird goes and sits on the roof as though to say, here it is, right? And the kids are overjoyed. And Hansel tells Gretel, you take the windows, I'm going to take the roof. And now we can have our fill. And they start eating. He picks out a piece from the roof, and Gretel goes and picks pieces from the window pane. And then a gentle voice comes from inside the cottage, asking, who's nibbling at my house? And at this point, the children, Hansel says, the wind, the heavenly child. And then they just, they're not distracted. They could just continue eating. And Hansel loves the cake, so he tears down another large piece, and Gretel keeps poking around the window pane to get more sugar. And suddenly the door opens, and a woman who looks as old as the hills, leaning on a crutch, walks out. And both the kids are so frightened, they just drop whatever they have in their hands. And the old woman shakes her head and says, oh, you poor children, what brought you here? Come in and stay with me, and no harm will come to you. So she takes them by the hand into the house. She serves them a nice, delicious meal, pancakes and milk and sugar and apples. And after that, she makes 2 nice beds, all decked in white, and tells them to go to bed and not worry about anything and sleep well. And all this while, she is just pretending to be nice. She had actually built the house precisely to lure such kids in. That was a trap. And the story says what she really wanted is to trap kids and cook them and eat them, right? And then the story goes on to kind of describe what a witch is, that this old woman was a witch. So witches, the story says, have red eyes, and they cannot see very far. They have poor eyesight, but they have a sense of smell like animals, and they can smell a human approaching from far away. So it's implied that when the kids were approaching the house, she already probably knew. And now when she was putting them into bed, so she was kind of laughing to herself and saying, now I have them and I will not let them get away from me again. Right. So the next morning, she went to their beds and then, looked at them all rosy cheeks and everything. And she said, okay, this is going to be a nice mouthful. And then she grabs Hansel, wakes him up, and then takes him to a cage and puts him inside the cage. And then she shakes Gretel up and says, get up. You need to go and fetch water and you need to cook food for your brother. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep him in the cage, feed him good food and fatten him up so that once he's nice and fat, I can cook him and eat him. And then Gretel is shocked and she starts to cry, but there's nothing she can do. She has to do what the witch tells her to do, right? And then every morning after that, the old woman goes to the cage, and because her eyesight is poor, she tells Hansel to stick out his finger out of the cage so that she can touch the finger and find out if he's, become more fat or if he's still thin. And Hansel has the presence of mind to pick a bone from that cage and put the bone out every single day. And when she touches it, she thinks he's still thin, and she's puzzled by it. Right? But she waits and waits, and after 4 weeks, she says, I can't wait anymore. It doesn't matter if he's fat or thin, I'm going to eat him. And she calls Gretel and says, you need to hurry up and get me some water. And today, I'm going to slaughter your brother and boil him. And then, poor Gretel, she was sobbing and crying and saying, oh, how I wish just wild animals had killed us in the forest. And then at least Hansel and I would have died together, right? And the old woman says, stop crying. Doesn't help you at all. So, she just carries on with that. She puts the kettle on the water. And then the witch says, first, we're going to bake. So I've put a fire in the oven. And, I just need to know if the oven's hot enough to put the bread in. So get inside and tell me if it's hot. And then what she's planning to do is basically push Gretel in and bake her and eat Hansel as well. But then, Gretel figures this out. She knows the witch is up to something. So she says, I don't know how to do that. And at this point, the old woman's impatient. So she says, you stupid girl, the opening is big enough for you to get in. Let me show you. I can get in myself. And she gets into the oven. And at this point, Gretel just pushes her into the oven, closes the door, secures it with a bar, and runs to Hansel's cage. And the witch is howling inside, and she gets completely burnt up. And Gretel goes and opens the cage. Hansel jumps out, and they both hug each other. They're so happy that finally, the witch is dead. And then they go around the house looking, and they find like chests and boxes of pearls and precious stones. And Gretel starts filling her apron with all of that, and Hansel starts filling his jacket pockets, and he says, these are better than silver pebbles. And then, they realize there's just so much to take back. And Hansel says, let's get out of the woods now. It's time to go back home. So they start walking back, and on the way, they come across a lake. And there's no walkway, there's no bridge to cross the lake, so they're stuck. And they don't know what to do. But Gretel at this point says, I see a duckling, and I can call out to the duckling and ask him to take us across the lake. And she calls out and tells the duckling, we are Gretel and Hansel. There's no walkway nor a bridge, so please take us onto your white back. So this white duckling comes up to them. Hansel gets onto it, and Hansel says, you can sit next to me, but Gretel says, no, I think we need to do this one at a time because we're too heavy for the duckling. So then the duckling takes Hansel to the other side, comes back for Gretel, takes Gretel to the other side, and then they start walking, and suddenly the forest starts to look familiar. And they find that at the end, they see their father's house. So they go to the father's house and knock at the door. The father opens the door and is so happy to see his kids back again. He hugs them, and they're happy as well. And it turns out that in the meantime, the stepmother had died. And so they are, they've come with pockets full of precious stones and pearls and riches. So, they live happily ever after. That's the story.
Yay! Thank you. Good job.
Thank you, Artie.
So I have a question before I.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been making notes, and I've made notes in the past few days too.
Yeah.
When you think about that story,
mm-hmm.
where do you enter into that story? What part of that story hits you the most?
For me, the first thing that surprised me, I was a bit taken aback, were the two aspects of the masculine in the story. The father, Hansel, right? I'm used to seeing patterns of sort of a weak masculine who hesitates or gives in to the evil stepmother's designs, or just isn't able to protect, the child's interest or the child itself. So it's a common motif in fairy tales. Where either the father is absent, he's a traveling merchant, so he simply doesn't appear in the story until the end when he comes back, right?
Right.
There are various forms of this masculine pattern, so that's common. But what really surprised me was just on the other side, there is this emerging masculine, the boy Hansel, who has so much presence of mind. He has so much wisdom and wit, and he's the one who actually protects the other emerging feminine, who's a sister. He's the one who assures her that everything will be fine. He's always coming up with plans. Even when he's locked in a cage, he has the presence of mind to give out a bone instead of showing his finger. So there's so much going on there with the emerging masculine archetype. And that's unusual, I thought. I've not seen much of that in stories.
Interesting. I love that.
So I was just like, how is this boy so clever? How is this archetype of, do you see that common in your healing work as well? Is it the emerging masculine with so much resourcefulness and stepping in for the dominant masculine in a way?
Yeah, it depends. It depends. I mean, that's the thing. Like when you read a dream, so when you see children and babies in dreams, right? Kittens, puppies, anything that's sort of young, right? So in this case, Hansel and Gretel, you can often regard them as symbols of the emerging aspects of that part of you. Right. So the father is the current inner masculine, and Hansel is like the emerging, like version 2.0. Right. So I have like long hair that's been there for a while, and then I have these baby hairs that are coming in as well. Right. So like constant, and eventually, right, Hansel will take over the role of the father. Right. And then Hansel and his partner, whoever it is, will like procreate, and then the next emerging. So it's this ongoing feeling of like growth, death, rebirth, transformation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so the thing is, like, one of the ways you kind of get orientated, in an advisee in yourself, right, is when you have a dream, you will see the young man or whatever, right, regardless of your gender, because we all have inner masculine and inner feminine within us.
Yeah.
And you will watch his behavior
Mm-hmm.
to get a sense for where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if my emerging inner masculine is completely like whining and weak and everything still,
Mm-hmm.
then that tells me something about the state of even my 2.0 inner masculine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so in this case, Hansel is very, very capable.
Mm.
Like, I totally caught that as well,
Mm.
right? Where the existing, and I mean, to be fair, there are elements of like masculine initiation in this as well.
Yeah.
Which harken back to Telemachus when we talked about Telemachus in our first sort of discussion on masculine initiation in the following way. The father is uninitiated.
Mm.
And there are a couple of big reasons. I mean, one is he doesn't take care of his kids. That's like the basic, that's the difference between a boy and a man, right? The man knows that he exists for something other than himself. The boy is just consuming everything,
Right.
including his own kids, right? If he is uninitiated and becomes like a biologically capable of having kids, he's had kids, but only in like animal mode. He's not an actual father until he's initiated, and he knows that I'm supposed to die for these kids, right? If it's a choice between my son and me, my son lives, I die, right?
Yeah.
So so he's uninitiated. That's the first sign. The second sign is that he is taking guidance from the false feminine. Right? He's taking guidance from this stepmother. And the question is, so the self is a quaternity. The self is a foursome, right? And ideally you have 2 masculine, 2 feminine, it's balanced. So at the beginning of every dream or fairy tale, you're kind of counting the numbers and seeing like if anything's missing. So not to, kind of completely pick on Catholicism and Christianity this session, but when you look at the Catholic Church, it's like, okay, there's a Trinity. There are 2 masculines. The Holy Spirit is feminine, but we don't say that in polite company, right? We just call it an it and leave it at that. And there's a missing fourth, right? So there's 2 masculines, there's sort of 1 feminine, and then the missing fourth obviously has to be feminine. And the only one standing outside the boundary line is Mother Mary. And we're like, well, but she isn't a goddess. We pray to her, we worship to her. We build churches and cathedrals, to Our Lady of Notre Dame, right? But she's not a goddess. She's not a goddess. Like, turn the camera away. Nothing to see here. So the self is a quaternity, and when you see the initial state, you're looking for where the balanced quaternity is degraded. And here you have a masculine and a feminine, and then a masculine and feminine, Hansel and Gretel, the parents in Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
And the only degradation here is that the mother is designated as step.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this is not about talking about blended families. I mean, if you're an actual this is all symbolic, right?
Yeah.
This is the stepmother within you.
Right.
And so the only reason step comes into play here is that it tries to get you to beg the question of where is the actual original feminine?
Yeah.
Right? Something wounding must have happened to have suppressed or transformed or killed off the original feminine.
Yeah.
And the signal difference between the father and Hansel is that the father follows the wisdom of the false feminine. And Hansel, right off the bat, follows the wisdom of the true feminine. And I mean, it's right. I mean, it would take hours to go through all the symbolism here, but he goes out immediately and he says, Gretel, don't worry, I'll take care of everything. And what does he do to take care of everything? He goes out under the light of the full moon, which is the symbol of the feminine goddess.
Yeah.
The color silver is associated with the feminine.
Yeah.
and he looks down and he picks up these white stones that glow silver like silver coins in the moon. And those are the things he gathers up. So he gathers up the wisdom and guidance, the GPS capability, if you will, of the feminine.
Yeah.
And that's what brings them home again.
And that navigates them through the forest. Yeah.
It maps them through the forest, which is the dark forest is a symbol of the unexplored regions of the self, right?
Yeah.
So it's the true feminine that guides you through.
Yeah.
And the difference is that the emerging inner masculine gets this instinctively and uses it, and the current inner masculine does not.
Yeah.
Right. Another signal of that the father is completely uninitiated. I mean, not that we need to pile on, we already know he's not, is that thing that steps out where, he's the first time he already gave in to the stepmother and they tried to abandon them, leave them for dead in the forest. The second time she said, we have to do this again. And he says, no. And it's not even the stepmother who says this. The narrator of the story literally turns into the camera and says, well, if you said A, now you have to say B. It's an extraordinary break in the proscenium arch of the story.
Yeah.
Where the narrator never addresses itself directly to the audience. And here you can see feel the narrator look directly at you and say, well, if you say A, you have to say B, of course. And don't you believe that for a second, right? Because what is the mark of adolescence, of uninitiated? It's the idea that I don't have a choice, right? I'm not an agent in the world. I'm not sovereign, right? The sovereign says, I said A, and now I say A again, or now I say 3, or I say Z, or I say P, or F. I say whatever I want because I'm the sovereign. Right. And it's the uninitiated that says, well, I feel like this is wrong. And someone just puts out some, stupid ass sort of arbitrary rule. If you said A, you have to say B. And it's like, oh, okay. And whatever you put out, my first instinct is to dopily follow it. Right? Because there is no higher guidance for that inner masculine. It's been cut off. It's been disconnected because his true feminine died off. Something happened, something wounded. And Hansel has, as you heal and the next version of your inner masculine grows, that has healed, and he knows instinctively to look for the guidance of the true feminine. I mean, the white bird, the cat, the duckling, all of these are sort of symbols kind of that. So it's this huge difference of, but the story doesn't exactly show you the mechanics of how you get from father to Hansel. It just kind of happens as a given.
Right.
Whereas with the tiger's adopted son, you saw all the sort of mechanics in detail of like how the boy came to like kill the tiger. So that was more of a detailed zoom in diorama of masculine initiation. Here we see the difference between initiated and uninitiated, but you don't get the detailed clockworks of, you don't get to watch exactly what happens. With Gretel, you get to watch that a little bit more closely. So what happens when you follow the improper feminine, the stepmother? Right off the bat, the first thing that happens is that she leads you twice to abandon the emerging parts of your own inner self. Right? There is no future without the kids.
Yeah.
Right. And if you abandon them and say, well, we'll just have more kids, that move, that set of values then gets inculcated into this kid. Your entire future line is like basically, poisoned at that point, you can argue, right? Until you do more healing. And so silver and moon are symbols of the feminine. The moon is the real mother here. The emerging masculine knows instinctively to seek the navigational powers and directions from the true full power feminine. I don't know if you mentioned the white cat on the roof.
I did. Yeah.
So the white cats are feminine. Is the real mother too. The full moon follows you even during the day. The false feminine is the one who says, takes it with the Cartesian view and says, well, that's not the cat, you idiot. That is the sunlight reflecting off the chimney.
Yeah.
right? But she's saying mythopoetically the same thing because the moon reflects the light of the sun too.
Yeah.
So she's looking at it from a sort of linear Cartesian view, scientific view, and he's looking at it from a mythopoetic view. The boy obviously speaks mythopoetically. He's the one that like sort of gets them out of this. That it's the mythopoetic view that protects Gretel long enough for her to complete her own transformation and initiation. So you almost can say one insight here is that in initiating masculine and feminine, there is this alternative, first one then the other. And here it's basically saying, in this case, the masculine goes first. Hansel is initiated.
Right.
He protects Gretel.
Yeah.
So that she can complete her initiation as well. And then perhaps she then gives him guidance, because in the end, she does liberate him.
Yeah.
Right? He's protected her. She completes her initiation by killing / transforming the witch power.
Yeah.
And then she liberates him.
Yeah.
In his embodied form. Right? The stepmother is the stepmother / witch, because they are the same being. It's just the witch is like the next level of the big boss of the false feminine.
Yeah.
The stepmother is like the tiger in the previous story, literally eating the children, taking a bite, trying to survive for themselves. The man is unlike the boy in the previous story.
Yeah.
If he were like the boy, he would so if the boy in the previous story were like this man, this father, he would not have set the boundary with the tiger. He would have been like, okay, I'll just take any girl you bring me without an ear, without a whatever. He would not have cut the tiger with the sword.
Yeah.
Right. That would have completely been aborted, failed, et cetera, et cetera.
Which is the point that kind of struck me even in the previous story, where this boy had the presence of mind and he knew exactly what to do, and he just did it in that one stroke. Whereas, a weaker masculine, uninitiated masculine would not have done that. And that's what we see in this story, where the father is like, oh, I don't know. I feel sad. I feel sorry, but I'm still not going to do anything decisive to protect my kids. Right. So there's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes forward, it's not a logical linear thing. It is a holistic thing. Right. So if you say A, then you have to say B. That's the rule. It's very linear. Well, it's precedent. So just, shut up and follow it. That is the pre-initiation pattern. Once you initiate into your manhood or kinghood or womanhood or queenhood, after initiation, what do you say? You say, I was like that then. I'm not like that now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why? Why is that? No reason.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't think, that's true. I think you're still that little boy or that little girl. It's like, doesn't matter what you think. Right. Well, I'm going to intervene and I think, and it's like, okay, well, we're going to go round and round because I put up a boundary. And I'm pushing you back saying my life is none of your business anymore. And if you're the mother, you'll be crying tears. You'll be like, oh my gosh, my little baby, what have you done? And then you need to negotiate that, that it's a traumatic, initiation is dangerous and not without risk.
Yeah.
Right. I was the boy, but I'm more than a boy now. When you initiate, you realize that you have a choice every moment. Couple other things I picked up here was that the birds, so the second round, when he has to drop the breadcrumbs instead of the silver coins, he has to use nourishment. So it's this choice, either or, of like nourishment, like the bread for nourishment or the bread for guidance.
Yeah.
And he sets the boundary and he says, I'm going to use the nourishment for guidance and forego the nourishment itself. Whereas the father would have been, I'm just an innocent victim of circumstance. Oh, woe is me. And he wouldn't do anything, right? And he'd be, eaten by the tiger. The boy makes the call and makes the decision, continues the action. And then the birds come and eat
the breadcrumbs. Yeah.
Now, this motif in Grimm's fairy tales of birds coming down and doing something. In Cinderella, the birds come down. She calls the birds down, and they pick the lentils out of the ash, which is one of the trials, the things she has to do, the impossible tasks, right? And it's the birds that come down and do it for her.
Right.
And this motif is birds are a symbol of spirit, of the spiritual side of you, of the air, right? They're basically angels. Wind wind and birds are interchangeable as well.
Yeah.
Like in the realm of prophecy, like the prophets, right? Sort of Ezekiel, Jonah, right? They speak in terms of wind and bird in the Bible. And so here it's the spirit that comes in and is removing your track back to the old inner feminine. You're like, is that to rescue me? It's like, no, it's to initiate you. It's to push you even further into the forest.
Right.
To the next level of false inner feminine, which is the witch.
The witch.
So this is circumambulation. So the true mother, in order to bring you to the next level of circumambulation, brings you further into the belly of the beast.
Right.
Because the witch's hut and literally the oven is the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
So that you can come out even further to sort of the next level.
So it does seem like, even in other times, like the true feminine and the crone are kind of working together to kind of push these things, because it's the white bird that actually guides them to the cottage of the witch. So
that's right. The birds erase your thing and they force you to wander, and then another bird guides you actually in.
Yeah. So it seems like it's a coordinated kind of move to get them to that point in their journey to
But even there, it's not without risk, because it's not a Cartesian like what's going to happen, right? You take this antibiotic pill, eat some yogurt, and you're done. There's no such guarantees, right? When you go into your own inner self like that.
Yeah.
Which is why, like, in the face of that risk, the uninitiated instinct is to just follow the previous rule. I said A, so I have to say B.
Yeah, because there's some form of certainty there. Like, I know where I stand, so I make these arbitrary rules. Yeah. And
that's the I mean, in all of these fairy tales, right? That's exactly what you don't do, right? That they're all like saying, don't do that, don't do that. That's the path of disaster.
Yeah.
Or, well, everyone else goes into investment banking and works at Google and sort of goes into hedge funds after college. I'll do that too. And it's like, okay, you can do that for a while. You can be at the stepmother and father's house for a while, but eventually you will, if you're lucky, right? Grace will push you into this like terrifying abyss, which you may not make it out of. But if you do, then you're on the other side and you can guide others as well.
Right.
And this is shown, I mean, the ambiguity of this is shown when they reach the cottage. The cottage is bread and then sugar and cake.
Yeah.
Right? So it's this mixture of like, bread is like true nourishment, right? It's the thing that guided you. It's the thing that nourished you.
Yeah.
And then in these kinds of symbolic systems, just from all the work I've done, I've come to associate with sugar, cake, with soothing. Right? Soothing wounds.
Literally too, even in the outer life. I mean.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cupcakes, brownies, ice cream.
Yeah.
It's not at all a bad thing when I do it. Maybe when you do it, but not when
yeah, right.
So when they reach the cottage, two critical things happen. The first is the children don't eat the bread. They're starving. They're like, oh, it's a famine and everything, right? Which is true. First move right out of the gate. They skip right over the bread and they go straight for the sugar and for the cake.
Yeah.
So they are genuinely starving, but when they are offered nourishment in the form of bread, they reach out to cake and sugar. They soothe.
Yeah.
There's something off about that. Secondly, when the voice asks who they are, they lie.
Yeah.
Right. And the nature of this lie is very specific. They are saying they're the wind. Right? So they're literally lying to saying that they are of the spirit. But just like me when I was making the joke, it's okay if I eat cupcakes because I'm so spiritual. Right?
Yeah.
So they lie and they say they are of the spirit when they are not.
Right.
And that is the trigger that puts them even further into the belly of the beast. Right? You're not this innocent victim of circumstance. I act in a very human way and I stumble even deeper into the hole.
Yeah.
And that is disaster from the profane standpoint. And from the sacred, it's like, yeah, you just advanced into the next level of circumambulation and initiation.
Right.
It's very exciting. We'll have a celebration at the other end when you come out, if you live.
Yeah.
If you live.
Yeah.
Right. And you're like, well, how do I make sure I survive this initiation? Right. And the natural instinct of the profane is, if I used to say A, I'll now say B. I'll just go in linear fashion. And that is absolute disaster. There is a rule in these fairy tales, in Northern European Celtic fairy tales.
Yeah.
That when you are guided by a helpful animal, because people will be like, well, I just go by my instinct. What if I'm a modern person and I have no sense of my instinct anymore? There is one almost always sort of, reliable rule, which is when an animal comes to you in a dream or symbolically in life and helps you and assists you, you can generally trust that animal and follow him all the way through, and you'll be okay. And the animal, obviously, is what we've said this before, is a symbol of your body self, your intuition, your instinct, not your intellect, not the abstract logical rules of A and B, but your instinct. So here they soothe. They don't knock on the door and follow hospitality rules, right?
Right.
And
Sorry,
they lie.
I missed that. Could you say it again?
Sorry. And they lie. So they get pulled into the realm of the witch. And the difference between a crone, witch I don't think of as an evil, as a bad thing. When I call my women friends and peers witches, it's a compliment of the highest order, right?
Right.
But here in fairy tales, what they call a witch is typically a kind of the monstrous, scary Baba Yaga form, right? Of the crone. And the difference here then is, what is the difference between a crone and a witch? Well, on the one hand, you can say there's no difference. It depends on your perspective, right? You could argue if they had come and sort of asked for help properly, not stolen, not eaten. There's a motif in fairy tales where if you eat without being invited, you're screwed, right? That's the beginning of when you've indentured yourself to the person and they have the right to eat you, right? There are rules in the forest as well.
Yeah.
But if you ask for help, if you introduce yourself, you validate yourself as I am Hansel and Gretel. We belong here. We're allowed to be here, right? And we demand your help. Then the witch has to help.
Yeah.
But here they go the crooked path. So the witch the crone becomes the witch. Another way to think about that in real life, right? It's the uninitiated man. You can almost call him the mama's boy, right, who never left the realm of the mother. Sorry, I don't mean to trigger you. The uninitiated mama's boy who never left the realm of the mother. And when he encounters women in his life, romantic women, as a man, but he himself doesn't even feel like a man. He feels like a boy. Right? Hemingway called them the great American boy men, but it's by no means just an American phenomenon. he will have interactions with women,
Mm.
or in the end, he will feel like he was consumed by a witch.
Mm.
Totally controlled me. Like she was just like awful. And he takes no responsibility. And he's telling his buddies, I was just basically an innocent victim of circumstance.
Mm.
Right? I'm not doing anything. I'm fine. It's these women that keep coming into my life. And it's like, you chose them.
Mm.
Right? We put a gun to your head saying you need to like marry this person. You did that yourself. Oh, but she tricked me. And basically it's like, she's the witch.
Yeah.
She's the witch. There's nothing wrong with me. Even though you went for soothing and you lied about who you were and what your intentions were, just like Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
So when you do that, you don't see the crone, you see the witch.
Yeah.
Because the lens you're using is different.
Yeah.
And then women too. It's the same, their own inner masculine, their own inner feminine is like this innocent victim of circumstance. Why do I keep seeing all these like horrible men? Now that's much more delicate because we are in a patriarchy.
Right.
Right. So there is this sort of sense of predation that happens, right? But the underlying physics are no different because, women are no different from men in that sense. I mean, in terms of being humans, and this is a diorama of what happens within a human.
I do think that's quite powerful because when you say that, I'm reminded of multiple instances where we do things to numb ourselves and soothe our wounds, and all the while we kind of actively deny what it is that hurts us. We don't really recognize the wound for what it is, and we tell ourselves all kinds of reasons as to why we soothe and how we soothe. So there is that, within us, and not to the outer world, not to anyone else, but within us, there is an active dishonesty that goes on. I mean, the intention of it is that, we're not ready to face that level of circumambulation, or we don't feel ready to kind of go with that journey and all of those things. But I think the way we do that is that dishonesty that the story shows. There's absolutely no reason for Hansel and Gretel to lie, but they simply don't want to tell whoever it is that we're kind of, munching away at your house without thinking of the consequences, without thinking of the niceties. But it's very telling because I think it's just a reflection of how we go about these things without putting much thought into that.
But at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
even that you could read as allegory or symbol.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to read what you just said as allegory, I would say, well, then you better be honest with yourself. You better have full self-awareness.
Yeah.
You better not lie to yourself.
Yeah.
But from a symbolic standpoint, without making a judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I mean, you put me in front of that house, I'd probably go for the cake too. Right? I mean, I'm more of a frosting man myself, so I would probably take just the frosting and leave the cake and leave the sugar, right?
Yeah.
So I would do the same thing.
Right.
And what this story is telling us, from a symbolic standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
is that the father failed. The mother got transformed and pushed out. The stepmother gave false wisdom. The father followed it. The kids almost died 2 or 3 times, emerging parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Even the emerging parts of yourself are imperfect, and they soothe, and they numb, and they lie.
Yeah.
If they hadn't lied, if none of those things have happened, those screwed up, awful, oh my gosh, I'm such a weakling, I'm so incompetent. If none of those things happened, the story would not have unfolded in the way it did.
Yeah.
And the initiation would not have happened.
Right.
That's the paradox.
Right.
All right. That's the paradox. It's like, oh my gosh, I gave birth to my child and I went through pain and I blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, we get that. But in the end, you have your baby girl, your baby boy. And that's just the way it happens. It's symbol, not allegory. And so that's why a story like this is a distillated archetype itself. it's not saying tell the truth and the witch will be okay. There's no, I mean, I'm kind of presuming that, right, based on what I know from other stories. But this archetype is complete. It's not banging you over the head trying to get you to do a certain thing. It's basically it's like when you look through an illustrated book from like the 1800s, and some artist, scientist like, Darwin or whatever illustrated what the sparrow looks like or what these plants look like. And there's these beautiful, that's not an allegory trying to get you to say like preserve nature and be eco. It's just giving you like, this is the life cycle of the coconut tree, period. That's it.
Right.
It's just distillating. This is what it is. And in exactly the same way, a fairy tale like this is basically saying this is the life cycle of a certain thing.
Right.
And that's why it's beautiful, because when you look at the little details in the fairy tale, which we won't have time to go into here, the crone, this witch, you could just say she's an awful old woman. She smells terrible and she tries to kill the kids. You could just leave it at that.
Right.
But here, they specifically say she has a strong sense of smell, but poor eyesight. Right? Why would they bother to say that, even in oral tradition? Because all of these things you have to memorize and pass down.
Right.
Smell is a symbol of instinct, and eyesight obviously is a symbol of vision.
Right.
And as we've said time and again, the ideal proper role of the inner masculine, of the inner feminine, is nourishment and vision.
Yeah.
Like vision for your life. What is my bliss? What is my purpose in life? All that comes from the feminine.
Yeah.
Right. Steve Jobs and Apple. Right. The feminine was very strong in him. He would get like Tim Cook to actually execute the vision, and run all those factories in southern China and all that stuff. Right. Nasty business that Steve Jobs was like insulated from, because his job is to like take down the deep space long range signal. Right. And then sort of the inner masculine parts of Apple would like execute and, do the dirty work where needed. Right. So here she has poor vision, and thus she provides nourishment, the house, in a messed up way, in the wrong way.
Right.
Right. And she has strong instinct, but poor vision. So she feels her hunger. Right. But she does the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But they basically, she provides like, soothing, right? And transposed into real life, it would be addiction, it would be all these things.
Yeah. So
I have enough instinct to know what the body needs and what I crave, but I don't have the higher vision to know how it all fits together.
Right.
The minute this Baba Yaga dies, the stepmother dies too, because they are one and the same. And death is in these stories a symbol of transformation. So in the moment that Gretel has the vision to see what is really going on, she kills/transforms the Baba Yaga.
Yeah.
By putting her into the consuming womb of the inner woman. That she's supposed to go in and be cremated because she is the oldest version. But the new growth is Gretel. And Gretel is the one who enforces the proper order of life. And when that happens, the stepmother dies too in parallel. This happens in these fairy tales all the time. Because they are actually reflections of the same thing. And once you transform one, the other transforms as well.
Right. Right.
It's interesting because it is Gretel that kills the witch. Right? The masculine and the false feminine, so the father and the stepmother/witch, they all underestimate the power and vision of the emerging feminine.
Yeah. Yeah, because until then she'd been crying and needed protection. And they all thought, she needs help. And she's the one who comes down and, Yeah,
all the action, right, is on Hansel. And you would assume, if this were like a Hollywood thing, that Hansel would be the hero with the automatic weapon and grenades, and he would be the one to kill the witch, and not so. He is actually the linebacker. I mean, sorry for the football analogies. He's the defender,
Yeah.
right, of the scorer, the quarterback, right, who is actually Gretel.
Yeah.
So he's blocking and clearing the way down the field, and she's the one who scores the goal.
Right.
She's the one with the vision. So the masculine and the false, the witch dies only when she tries to kill the emerging feminine. Right, so she threatens to kill Hansel, and that's fine. When she tries to kill the emerging part of herself, that's when the transformation happens. Something triggers, and it's like that. It doesn't work like that. The physics don't work like that.
Yeah.
And you know, the thing is, like, the witch to me, the witch signals the ending of grief by telling Gretel to stop crying.
Right.
Or the attempts to stuff down the grief. This is somehow what gives Gretel power. The oven, in the chat, by the way, I just dumped the link to the Sacred Space session we did a few months ago on the crone, the archetype of the wise woman, in case people want to see that.
Yeah.
To sort of zoom into this symbol of the witch. The oven is a kind of womb, obviously, so the witch dying is a rebirth. It's the coffin, but it's the coffin of the witch and the womb egg of Gretel, because once she does that to the witch, she becomes like the reigning queen of the story.
Yeah.
Right at the end of the story, she is the dominant feminine.
Yeah.
Which is what is supposed to happen. Just like when the caterpillar goes into the cocoon is the tomb of the caterpillar and the egg/womb of the butterfly.
It almost seems like
dies, and then Gretel comes up.
Yeah. It almost seems like Gretel pushing the witch into the oven is the initiation moment and equivalent of the boy killing the tiger with a sword in the previous story.
Right.
It is like that moment. Yeah.
I mean, that's why, even though there's all this stuff we've been talking about, masculine initiation, we call this story a story of feminine initiation of the inner feminine. Right, so the Baba Yaga is the tiger of the inner feminine. It's the raw power of the feminine, the tiger, just like raw masculine power, just like the tiger. If boundaries are not set, she will attempt to consume and abort the emerging inner masculine and inner feminine.
Right.
The tiger would have eaten the boy and the girl together.
Yeah.
Right, and the way the boy does it is through the tempered sword of masculine power. And the way Gretel does it is through the womb of the feminine.
Yeah.
In its coffin. Right? She doesn't kill her with a sword. She could have just taken a kitchen knife and stabbed her. But symbolically, this is a transformation of the inner feminine through the power of the inner feminine, which is the power of the womb. Right? The womb is I mean, it's the beginning and end of life.
Right.
It's where you come from, and it's the coffin that you go back into. The Ouroboros, where the snake eats its own tail, that point of the snake eating its own tail is the womb/tomb.
Right.
And so this is the thing that nurtures you, that gives birth to you. But this is also the thing that gives you vision. Because the thing that bounds us and directs our vision is the fact that, like, we will die.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of, like, you know, I'm going to die at some point. So I have to decide, you know, however days I have left on the earth in this form, what I'm going to do with those days. And to decide that, I need vision.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why, I mean, it's not, I mean, so when we say the inner feminine, the two functions of the inner feminine are nurturing, nourishment, and vision, that's kind of what we mean.
Yeah.
Okay. It's when, you know, the tiger/witch tries to consume the emerging feminine, then it's the wrong sequence.
Yeah.
It's the wrong sequence. Right? Just like in Chinese culture, it's like, as a parent, let's say the kid is like eating and is like, oh, you like this, let me give you some from my bowl. And it's like the parent would like recoil from that. Because symbolically, it's like, I cannot take food out of my kid's bowl. That's like not okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sometimes my son John, when he's finished eating, I'm like, are you done with this? And he's like, yeah. And he's like left half the bowl because, he's 14. So he's already had 6 bowls. And I'll like eat his leftovers. It's okay as the father to eat his leftovers.
Yeah.
It's not okay to eat from something he's actively nourishing himself with, because I'm taking food out of his bowl. That's like not okay.
Okay.
If I actually did that, I would like break out in a rash or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other observation here, just really quickly, is just going through these notes. The children, as parts of the inner whole, do accept the witch's hospitality.
Right.
She doesn't imprison them. She does feed them first. They do lie to her.
Yeah.
And eat without invitation. So there's falsehood on both sides. This is not a good versus evil thing.
Yeah.
Even the father. People are like, oh, that evil stepmother. It's like, why are these, I can just imagine all the stepmothers out there who are listening. Right? Like, why are these stories always vilifying stepmothers? This is horrible. It's like, no. That's part of the coded message. Yeah. The father is complicit with the stepmother.
Yeah.
He is just as guilty.
Yeah.
Right? He's just as guilty. But because he's in this mythopoetic archetype of uninitiated boy man, nobody blames him, because instinctively in our gut, we know he's useless. Right? Just like certain political figures in leadership in the world right now. It's like, some of us are like vilifying them. It's like, how can he be so responsible? And others are just like, he's cool. He's like me. Because they are, it's the boy men who like vote the boy man into office. So the father is complicit with the stepmother. There's cheating, backstabbing all around. Nobody is like, nobody's fingers are clean. And this is the cauldron, right, of fermentation, of gestation, that sets the stage for deeper transformation.
Like you said, that's what adds to the drama. That's what actually triggers the drama. So that's where all the action starts. So yeah.
And as we said in the Shiro kind of story, the Japanese folktale, one way to take guidance is to like do the accounting in the beginning and the end.
Yes.
Right. So in the beginning of the Shiro story, their greatest sorrow, as the story itself said, was they were childless. And in the end, even though he's like this, great person with a title and rich and has unlimited food, he is still childless.
Right.
So we're like, okay, it's not an allegory for just saying you should be like this old man, right? Something else is wrong. In this story, the thing was solved in the end. In the beginning, something was off with the feminine.
Yeah.
And in the end, the improper feminines are both gone off stage, and Gretel is singularly in full power.
Yeah.
So whatever happened in between was like the right thing. However messy and circumambulatory it was.
But it's still not a quaternity, right? It's still 2 masculines and 1 feminine if you just had to count the characters at the end.
Correct. You could count. The way these physics go, I'm not going to sort of write the ending to the story, right, or write the next chapter. But if you were to continue the story forward under the same sort of principles of the physics of these things, the father would probably die off too. Right. And then they would both marry their mates and live happily ever after. So there would be a new quaternity of Hansel and his partner.
Right. So the story does leave an opening for that development and say, okay, this is the natural progression. So we just kind of stop here, because what we really wanted to talk about was the initiation pattern of the emerging feminine.
Right, because the whole journey, the sort of next circumambulation of masculine looking for partner and feminine looking for partner. I mean, that's like 6 other like fairy tales.
Yeah.
Right, it's like the 7 swans, or sort of 7 brides for 7 brothers, like all these other things.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other sort of page of the illustrated manual of the life cycles of these different organisms and phases of life.
Right.
And so fairy tales are fragments of different angles of human development and archetype. Even in the realm of feminine initiation, Hansel and Gretel is showing one aspect of feminine initiation.
Yeah.
There are other fairy tales, even within this Grimm's collection, that show other aspects. They show feminine initiation from different angles. So, for instance, Snow White is another story, which is all about feminine initiation. There's an evil stepmother and a witch. And dwarves, so the inner masculine manifold coming up out of the forest, right? So the inner masculine in the forest, the dwarves are like helpful. You can treat them as like animals, because dwarves are like sort of like they're like wood sprites, right?
The forest people. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, you just like a fox, just like a wolf showing up and helping you, you can trust the dwarves. You can trust the dwarves, right?
Yeah.
And Snow White, I mean, I teach Snow White in the sort of mythic healing, the continuing healing series, is a story about initiation through recovering the power of your voice with the apple that was stuck in her throat. Cinderella, which we also teach, right, is a story about the power of grief and surrender in discernment, because of the ashes. Like cinder is like ash, right? So she's like ash girl, Cinderella. And then the third big one we teach, as you know, is the handless maiden. So it's like capability, ego power. And these are all stories we use in continuing healing that we used to use in that series that was the precursor to 7-day healing. So even just for feminine initiation, there's like a whole bunch of stories. It's like an MRI where like all these cameras are shooting in from different angles to give you the full 3D picture of like what is going on.
Right.
And each of these stories nourishes us. And we get something different every time we read them.
So, I mean, it's really powerful how the stories illustrate different aspects and different angles, as you say. And I think that's a great way to look at it, is that, because life is complex. So there are various ways our experiences manifest because of, the inner feminine not being initiated, or the inner masculine not being initiated.
Right.
There are different wounds that we have and different experiences that we go through because of those things. And when we do cross, the threshold, and when we do get initiated, the way it happens could be very, diverse and different. But it's like, okay, there's a whole library of fairy tales that illustrate all these different archetypes, and you just one, and whichever you relate to, you have a map for what's going on within you.
Right.
There's really like different kinds of illustrations, and you just pick whichever you resonate with, and then you work with that.
Right. And the thing is, like, if you read a story like this and try to come up with a list of a 5-point plan, right, for how to initiate your inner feminine, that again is this profane reflex of trying to control and make it contained and predictable, right? Predictable meaning controllable, right? And so, so people are looking for guidance. So how do I apply this? One is the insights come to you and they kind of enter at the body level, right? A story like this feeds your intuition about things.
Right.
Not necessarily your intellect.
Yeah.
Right. I'll say these very interesting things about symbolism and lead it back to like other references, mainly to sort of get your intellect to go, oh, okay.
For the buy-in.
Yeah. He's been doing this for a while. He has all these followers. He went to Harvard and Stanford. Fine. I guess I'll like give him a pass. So
Right.
the intellect is like sent outside for like a cigarette break, so that we can directly commune
Yeah.
with the intuition and instinct.
Right.
Right. And it's at that level where oftentimes people will say, I did the exercise after the Hansel and Gretel thing, and here are the insights I came to.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was listening to Hansel and Gretel, and I was like, whatever, that's a stupid story. Even though I found myself listening to the whole thing, I don't know why. And then 3 nights later, I had this mind-blowing dream, right?
Right.
Where your inner intuition responds, right? It's like a call response. It's like, well, here's the version of how it's happening in you now,
Right.
in the current phase of your life. So these stories have a way of working that is, it's self-circumambulatory, not controllable, not predictable. And that's why we tend to do things like this, stories like this, in sacred space, right? Where this is one of the few spaces we have in modern world where, like I said in the beginning, we're here to hold space for each other and ourselves, however we find ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? I'm Hansel and Gretel. I'm outside the witch's hut, and I'm lying through my teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's coming and saying, no, don't lie. It's just, I hold space for the fact that you're lying through your teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we are. It just is what it is. That's where we are.
Yeah.
And in sacred space, you can allow that to happen. And then it will have the elbow wiggle room to continue gyrating through its circumambulatory motions. Also, that's like what we always say is the difference between healing and curing, right? Curing is where does it hurt, and I'm just going to nuke it with ibuprofen and make the pain go away. Great.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Healing asks the question, why does your elbow hurt in the first place? And you might say, because I've been playing tennis like 10 times more than I was before. It's like, oh, well, why are you doing that? And it's like, well, I just, need to get out of the house. Right? It's like, why do you need to get out of the house? It's like, well, my partner and I have been like fighting. It's like, okay. It's much more complicated. It doesn't fit into a 20-minute doctor visit.
I thought you were going to give me a pill. And then
you're going to give me a pill. It's like, well, we can do that too, but that's my collaborator down the hall. And here it's like, you walked into the wrong room. You walked into the witch's hut. You walked into the witch's hut.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's one point that just struck me now when you elaborated on this dynamic of the inner masculine, where he says, oh, because I said A, I have to say B, and because I have made this arbitrary rule that I have to be consistent. And then suddenly when you're not consistent, you realize you don't have to be consistent. There is that break. That point is the initiation, right? So I see a similar kind of thing happening with Gretel in the story, where all the while she's crying. And at the point where, Hansel is first put in a cage, the story says, well, what is poor Gretel to do? She just has to, she's crying, but she has to do what the witch asks her to do.
Right.
And then there comes a point where the witch actually asks her to go into the oven, and Gretel says, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Show me.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So there is the point where Gretel says, I don't have to do what the witch tells me to do.
Right.
I'm going to decide what
I've been following the witch's orders up to that point.
Up to that point. And only that point she says, not doing it.
And so, to me, what that speaks to is the idea that at this point, they're out of the house. They're out of the shallower parts of the forest. They're deep in the forest, in the unexplored regions of the unconscious, which is what the forest symbolizes.
Right.
So even just, and then they're deep in forest, and then they are stepping across the threshold into the hut of the witch. So if you're like, there's no detail in the story that shows exactly why Gretel all of a sudden grew a spine and said, just because I said A, I don't have to say B. That is part of the magic.
Right.
Because the witch's hut then itself is a cauldron.
Yeah.
It is the womb. It's where Hansel and Gretel have gone to die, basically.
Yeah.
And transformation happens in the womb of the witch's hut.
Yeah.
And so after 4 weeks there, right, which is what the story said, something transforms in Gretel. And you're like, well, that doesn't help. I don't know, how do I get the same kind of transformation? And the answer is the rest of the story tells you. In this case, it's your own inner masculine has already somehow been initiated, and he protects the inner feminine orbiting around her, right, to basically get her to the critical point of being in the witch's hut. And even then, he's like, he gets locked away. He's ready to be slaughtered.
Right.
And he's still fighting the good fights, putting out the bone, et cetera, right? And then in the witch's hut, right? So this is the emerging inner feminine in the womb of basically the grandmother, you could almost say. And that's where her transformation initiation happens. Which makes sense because in many sort of human cultural traditions, it's the grandparents who skip over the parents' level and directly initiate the grandchildren.
Right.
Right. Often as a child, you feel more affinity with your grandparents than you do your parents. Right. Because your parents are in the thick of it and your grandparents have that sort of higher vision, et cetera, sometimes. So anyway, once you get into the witch's hut, part of the message is it will just happen. You don't have to worry about that part. It's like when you're making wine, it's like, well, how do you grow? How do you water? Do you do dry farming? How much do you fertilize? Is it organic? Is it not organic? You can decide all that getting up to the point of the witch's hut, but once you do the mash and everything and you put it into the barrel, there's additional magic that happens in the barrel that you don't have to worry about. If you did the setup up to the barrel properly, everything in the barrel will take care of itself.
Right.
Right. At some point, I mean, this is just like life and circumambulation. At some point, you have to surrender and let go.
Yeah. Yeah. The point Bachi says here is, I agree. I was also coming to that there is 4 weeks of Gretel collecting water, carrying wood, and doing everything that the witch has been telling her to do. So somehow that has contributed to her transformation as well. So those 4 weeks. It reminds me of the fairy tale Devil's Sooty Brother, where this, where the soldier's been chopping wood and feeding the fire and boiling the kettles. He spent 7 years doing that, and that ultimately contributes to the transformation of his grief. That's right. Yeah.
And 4 weeks, in fairy tale time, can be 4 years, can be 40 years, right? And sort of historical lapse time. It's symbolic. It's symbolic.
Right.
I love that. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It's amazing. And this whole initiation of grandparents to grandchildren, I was thinking, suddenly I was reminded of why we say, a recipe was handed down by my grandmother. Right. It's just so common to call it grandma's recipes and not, we do say my mother's recipes as well, but, grandma's recipes is there, right? So it's like, we love saying that this is something that came down from my grandmother or my granddad taught me this.
Oh, it's that extra authority, right?
Such a
my mother's recipe, they may be like, well, is it any good? If it's my grandmother's recipe, it's like nobody's gonna say that.
No one questions it.
No one's gonna question that.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Should I move on to the exercise and then close up?
Yeah, exercise, so I kind of moved in the background. Thanks, Artie.
Thank you. Good job. Thank you. All right, thank you so much, Gary. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll just give the exercise that we have thought of for this week between now and our next session, and then I'll close the session. So the exercise is pretty straightforward. It's the question of just reflecting over the next few days, only if you want, no pressure to participate. What has been the stepmother / witch in your life, right? In the outer world, but also in the inner world. We say the outer is a reflection of the inner. So what is the inner feminine force of nurturing and vision that may have been sort of, wounded or degraded in some way, where it also has ended up constraining and shaming and even stifling, right, in your life. So most people, when I say that, they will instantly go to some outer, they'll be like, oh, it's my mom, or it's my aunt, it was whatever. So even if you would say it's your mom in real life, it is your inner mom and a force within you, right? Because the outer is a reflection of the inner. Another way to say that is, if you say, oh, it was my mom, it's like, well, your mom may not even be on the earth anymore, right? Because she's just like passed on. And even if that's the case, you can still hear those things your mom said to you in your head, just like they were like 15 minutes ago, right? So it is a voice in your head, right? That was maybe put there by someone, but it is a force within you. So then the question is, what is the action of this inner feminine force in you? Does it have more instinct than it does have vision? If it lost vision, why did it lose vision? Or what wound, what event caused the witch to have loss of its vision? And then how, over time, has this inner feminine force been transformed into you, in you, right? Has the witch transformed into Gretel? How did it happen? Or has it happened yet? Right? And if it hasn't happened yet, where are you right now in the journey? And then similarly, what is the emerging feminine in you? What is the Gretel in you? Where is she? And what does she need from you? Does she need protection? Does she need your GPS guidance through the forest to get to the next step of the organic process? Okay. So anyway, that's the exercise to try. Only if you want. No pressure to, no expectation of participation. But I wanted to sort of draw that out just in case people wanted to go deeper. All right. So with that, we're at the end of our session, and I'll go ahead and close our sacred space session. Our next session is Sunday. It's free. It's open to everyone, so please invite other people. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, wherever, and we'll gather these for a Q&A session at some point. And then you have the call to action link in your Crowdcast, the green button, to sign up for next week, next Sunday right now if you want. And on Facebook, there's a link in the text of the post, of the live post, where you can click in and sign up for next week's Crowdcast live sacred space. Okay, so with that, I will hereby close this session of our shared sacred space. Thank you for holding this space with us, and thank you for sharing the nourishment, the emotional nourishment, the spiritual nourishment of this shared sacred space with us. I give you my blessing. Go in peace, bestowed with blessing, free of fear, free of threat, and free of the undue control of others. Have a great day, have a great week, and I will see you all in the next session. Thank you. Thank you.